So, Carol, welcome again. And whenever you are ready to begin, we're here.
Okay, thank you. All right. Well, good to be back with everyone and to see everyone, in the gallery instead of having had the webinar last week where I couldn't see you. And so before I begin on tonight's topic, any thoughts or reflections or questions or comments that you have from last week?
Oh.
Give you a few minutes to think about that and just join in the conversation. You can just raise your hands or just jump in. Thoughts, reflections, comments? Or anything that we've talked about thus far. We talked about daughter Zion last week. Yeah, Fran.
Last week we spoke about how the whole thing around the readings that are read at in the liturgy, Sunday liturgy, and whatever, and the dilemma that's posed in regards to the violence that sits here is just it's horrendous. But it also can give license to, particularly our first week, give license when we were talking about, I think, Hagar, that, if you just go back and you be good, everything will be all right when women leave relationships where there's violence. So how is it possible to influence? Because I don't think everything should be taken out of the lectionary, but how is it possible to influence the balance of what it is that we listen to?
See, okay, so here's my response to that. First of all, not all of the biblical texts in the Bible, of course, are included in the lectionary readings. There's certain texts that have been chosen for certain cycles, cycle A, B, and C of the readings. And the second thing is, I don't think any of the lectionary readings should be taken out. What I do think is that we can read them, but then the key to that is the preaching on them. That's the important thing. And also, how do people then hear these texts? And how do we read these texts? That's the important piece to all of this. So it is on the preaching. And if we were doing this in a Bible study group, are we again reading with the grain or reading against the grain? And if you excuse me 1 minute, I'm just going to draw my blind here because it's bouncing off my glasses. I'll be right back. Okay, I think that's a little bit better. A little bit. Little bit. Other questions or thoughts you might have?
Carol.
Okay. Oh, go ahead. Yes.
This is just a general question, but
Jean.
when we're reading scripture on our own,
Yes.
We don't have you with us,
Yes.
And so how do we read it against the grain? Because for most of us, we don't have your kind of background.
Right. And it's let me just say, first of all, muster up your self-confidence, even if you say you don't have the background, because remember, I teach undergraduate students and they don't have any background either in any of this. And what I'm teaching you to these 5 sessions are the skills that you need to read against the grain. And I can send to Matthew the sheet that I've given that talks about the hermeneutical skills for the 21st century that'll give you some ideas on how to read against the grain. But at the same time, what we have to listen to is it's almost like we have to decolonize our own minds. And that's a hard journey because we are so, and we're going to see this today, we are so used to either praying with these texts, which is important, but then how do we hear these texts, you know, from whose perspective? Like today, I'm going to talk about imperialism, metaphor, and marriage. And we're going to listen to some texts from Isaiah. And there's one from Gaza that is going to be really, really pertinent. And from Amos, rather, that's going to be really pertinent. Now, you know, how are we hearing these texts? Are we hearing them from the margins? Are we coming fresh, or do we fresh into these texts? Or do we have these layers and layers and layers of teaching, basically biblical teaching and theological teaching that we've got to sort through? And that's a hard journey because we've just been so enculturated and so ingrained. As one of my students who is 22 said to me yesterday, she's a junior, she said to me, now that I hear these texts in the class and as we look at them, I have all kinds of questions. And she said, and I've gone to Catholic grade school, I've gone to Catholic high school, I've done this all my life. She says, but I've got all kinds of questions. She said, and it makes me wonder, where have I been all my life? And she's only 22. You know, where have I been all my life? Why have I not heard these texts in this way? Most of us don't until we get the first awakening. And when we get the first awakening, as we go through this, when you wake up, all it takes is one aha moment, and then you've basically got it. And a lot of this is going to jump out at you tonight, too. Particularly when I read the text from Isaiah and Amos, and also from Hosea, because I will read the Hosea text with the grain, and I will read the Amos and the Isaiah text with the grain. But I'm going to give you some background on all of this. And then how do we hear it in light of the 21st century? That's the thing. How do we hear it in light of the world in which we are living today? And even we were doing in my class the other day, Proverbs 31. And I mean, I read that at my mother's funeral. And it's the story of the woman who can do everything and does everything. And yet when you look at the language, she is like the ship of merchants. Here you have a woman being compared to a ship. How do we hear that today? Yeah. And as one of my students said, hey, I like this woman. She is a businesswoman. And she, yes, she's the mother. She takes care of the family. She's preparing the meals. She's getting up in the middle of the night. She's doing everything. But when you read it against the grain, we say that's a wonderful woman. But where is her husband? Her husband is sitting at the city gates doing nothing with the elders. And so, first of all, what kind of marriage do you have here? Second of all, who's sustaining the household? And third, what kind of a model is she for women? These are the questions. And if women espouse to this kind of model, then you'll never have the real partnership that should happen in marriage of shared responsibilities without one being understood as the elite one that sits at the city gates, the breadwinner, Or as I said to my students, yes, the old slogan, behind every successful man is a woman. That doesn't wash anymore today. So do you see, Jean, a little bit about how not,
Yeah.
and so how do we hear this in the contemporary context of the contemporary world?
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts? But I hope it'll come clearer tonight.
Okay.
Anything else? Comments? And if you're so inclined to turn on your screens, I'd love to see your faces. But if not, that's okay too. Maria, you have your hand up? You got to unmute yourself, Maria.
Okay, I'm sorry about that delay. Yeah, I couldn't find the icon to raise my hand on the screen. I had posted a comment, may not be directly in response to your invitation for comments, but just one thing that has always bothered me in reading the Old Testament is the amount of violence and aggression and displacement of other people in the settlement of what we might call the promised land, or
we're going to deal with that today.
Oh really? Oh, good. Because as I said, it's always troubled me. I've never really been able to reconcile the harm and the injury done to other people, although the Lord is leading the settlers into the territories. And that's
okay. I get where you're coming from, and I have to say, remember now, this is going to get a little dicey today when I begin this, and I'm going to begin it now, because these are the Jewish texts, and this is from the Jewish world. They're not Christian texts, but the Christian texts are just equally as bad too when you take a look at what's going on with Paul and the militaristic language that is there. And you get some of this also in the New Testament, the way it is shaped as well, the misogyny against women when you're looking at the Christ, and the way the story was shaped. Okay, the way the story was shaped. And the stories, I should say. So you've got a lot of gender stuff going on in the New Testament. You got a lot of violence in the Old Testament, but the disparity in the New Testament is equally violent. It's not physically violent, but it's psychologically violent and gender violence. Because I mean, even we think, oh, the Last Supper. Oh, yes. Well, the text only gives us a supper with 12 of the guys. And the women are not invited to the table, but of course the women were there. So there's the exclusion there. So there's all different kinds of issues we can say with both testaments that are a form of violence, the erasure of women. Certainly, they say, oh yes, women are in the New Testament, but only to a minimum amount, the stories that we have. And, but in the Old Testament, what we have to remember is that this is the Middle Eastern world that we're talking about too. And what was going on then is still going on now. And that's why today I'm going to talk about imperialism. And the texts that we have, they're shaped by a militaristic culture, and they're very violent. And it's what I like to say is, are these texts revelatory? Are they revelation? And people say, no, no, no. I say, yes, they are, because they reveal to us of what is still in need of being transformed today. And what is still in need of being transformed today is our images and our understandings of the sacred one. Because what we see so much in the texts is that we create the sacred one in our image according to our likeness, because we want the warrior God. And that's the Jewish God that we have. And then also, and it's not just the Jewish God, it's the God of the Christian people as well, too. It's a god of it's the god of the Jewish Christian tradition, period. And then what we see is, but they're the Jewish Christian texts. That's what I'm saying, sacred texts. But what we see going on in the texts from the world behind the text is still going on today. There is no difference with these leaders. And so it is the systemic cycle of violence. And we've got to somehow break the systemic cycle of violence. But when we read these texts again and again, it will, if we don't call it out and we don't hold it up for critical theological reflection and just social reflection, it will embed the violence in our psyches again, and it will sanction the violence. And so that's why we have to raise the awareness that what is most prophetic in these texts is it gives us a vision of what's going on in the world past and in biblical times and what's still going on today. And so we need to have a prophetic response to the texts. We can't read them and say, well, what do I get out of the text? No, we have to exercise our agency and say, okay, what is our prophetic response to these texts? Is it to condone the texts, or is it to say, hey, we've got to look at these texts and we've got to acknowledge that the human condition continues on the way it has been with leadership? Does that help, Maria?
It does. It does help a great deal. And if I may just make one brief comment.
Absolutely.
Not directly related to the first comment, but relating to one of the points you had raised about violence in the New Testament, and much of it being gender-based. The other one passage in the New Testament that, again, I always have trouble reconciling is the woman caught in adultery. And with all the discussion of the woman being caught in adultery and, you know, should she be stoned, the only thing I can think of is, well, where is the guy? And why is there no discussion of his role?
Because if it's written by men, they're not going to put the men in the hot seat.
Right.
It's the woman's problem all the time. That you see in the Old Testament all the way. It goes all the way back to the way the women have been shaped. Eve was shaped as a temptress. She's the one that caused the downfall of the man. And so therefore she will be punished throughout history.
Yeah.
And that's what we have here. And it's how, who wrote the text and who shaped the texts. And that's what I say the injustice is that, first of all, it's supposed to be the man and the woman. If they're caught in adultery, they're to be stoned. Number two, who said she was caught in adultery? She's just brought before there. Where's the evidence? All right, so we don't have any evidence. So these are the issues that we have to raise with the text and say this is an excellent text, you know, to talk about with regard to ethics. There's no partner here, so it's they're just condemning the women. It's a group of men condemning the woman. Jesus says, you who are without sin, cast the first stone. They let go of all the stones and they all go away. And one of my students once said, then I guess Jesus stays, and so he's with sin. You know, so I mean, the way people twist this story up, you know, but anyway, you know, it's I don't condemn you, go on your way. But we have problems with regard to the legal system. And the legal system always challenges the woman. Well, did you deserve it? Well, you were dressed like this. Well, what did you do to deserve this? Only recently do we take the part of women in situations, and we also don't know. Here's the other question. We're going to confront this adultery and this woman of whoredom, so to speak, when we do the Isaiah 1-3 text. Who knows what kind of a husband she had? A spouse. Was he unfaithful? Was he abusive? Was she driven to this? Did she have a lapse of fidelity because she was treated so poorly? We have no evidence of any of this. All we have is a text that written by the men that condemns the woman, and the man is off scot-free. So we've got problems in the culture all around, and it's the culture. It's the culture. But when we read this, you know, again and again and again, you should have a problem with it, but you should be raising the questions all over the place, the ethical questions. So what evidence have the men put forward to condemn the woman? But do we see this today? Women stand condemned. We've seen this in Supreme Court hearings where women have come forward and they're not even believed.
Yes.
So I love these texts because they provide us with teachable moments if we grasp the teachable moment. And if we raise the questions and interrogate the text and interrogate the culture.
Well, thank you very much for all of these questions and approaches to understanding the reading or interpreting the reading.
Yeah. See, and once we get it out of the religious realm, even though it is a sacred text, we can have fun with it. We're meant to play with it. We're meant to take a look at it because the whole world are reading these texts, not just religious communities, but we've got to ask the questions that come not within the context of religious circles, but in the context of the everyday world circles.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, tremendously, a tremendous amount of sense.
Okay, so, okay, Fran, I am gonna give you the time to ask the questions now because then we'll have some questions throughout this, but we go till 5:15. Go ahead, Fran. Fran, you gotta unmute yourself.
Mute, yeah. So it comes back to that point that is around the preaching and also interpretation, and who's in charge of interpreting what we listen to and what we hear. In small study groups or with a group of women, it's possible to nurture something that actually does say, let's really look closely at this. But like just recently in the parish that I'm in, one of the men said, I'll put his hand up to run women's retreats. And I just, myself and one of the other person that was present said he didn't have any awareness of really what he was saying, that, you know, that in a way, because he was sort of duplicating that he could narrate the story. Maybe I'm being judgmental of him, but who interprets the text? Who speaks to the text in the different forums that we
remember what I said, readers grounded in their social locations create biblical meanings.
Okay.
And so people are going to hear this text in different ways. And you will know how people hear these texts. You will know from what perspective they're coming from. Okay, now I'm going to move us to tonight because I have some exciting things to share with you for tonight. Okay, so tonight's lesson is going to be on imperialism, metaphor, and marriage. And imperialism, I'm going to deal with the Isaiah and the Amos texts and the God of the Empire. And then I'm going to give you some backgrounds on metaphor, and then I will give you some. We'll look at marriage, and we'll look at Hosea 1-3. So we got a lot to do in about, let me see, 45 minutes. So here we go. Okay, now I'm going to give you some theory. Empire studies and post-colonial studies. It's a way of interpreting the texts. And if it would help at some point, I can also send you my notes because I have them all here. I just finished them before we got online here, and I can send them off to Matthew, and then he can send them to you as well. Even though the meeting is being transcribed. It is being transcribed, but if you want the notes. Okay, so empire building and imperialism is concerned with power. So just remember what I'm saying for when we get to the text itself. The empires in existence during the biblical times of prophetic literature included the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and the Persian Empire. So we're talking about empires in the prophets. In the prophetic books of the Bible, we see the prophets advocating for nations to fight against nations, surprisingly. And we're going to talk about that specifically. The prophets, as characters and messengers of the divine, are heavily engaged in proclamations against nations and the battles of the empires. Heavily engaged, the prophets are. Okay, male prophets. Steve Davidson, in his article on post-colonial readings of the prophets, makes these 2 points. Number one, the prophetic literature was finally assembled during empire times and reflects the socio-cultural and theopolitical forces that gave rise to the empires. And see, this is what I said earlier, way back in the first class. Culture influences the writings of the texts, and the texts themselves then influence culture. And some of the material is re-inscribed into the contemporary culture when we don't hold it up and interrogate it for critical reflection. And the second point he makes, empires deploy literature, which is a prophetic text. Empires deploy literature as a medium for their message, and the literature participates in the world framed by the will of empires. The empires operate as the controlling frame for the representation of the prophetic texts. In other words, as I said to you earlier, whether we want to face it or not, there is a political intention in many of the writings of these prophetic texts. And at this time, Israel is trying to become a great nation. Israel would love to have become an empire. And so these are the texts that reflect the sovereignty of the deity, the monarchical deity. Israel's God is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, the sovereign one. Everybody's supposed to fall in line with Israel's God. Everybody is to obey Israel's God. Israel's God is the Lord of history. Israel's God is the host, the commander-in-chief of the armies, who's above all the nations and commanding all the nations. And what you hear in the prophetic text is the commander-in-chief, and that's what you get. That's the Lord of hosts. That's what it means. The commander-in-chief is going to send in the Assyrians against Israel to punish Israel, and Assyria will be the club in my hand. And then the Babylonians are going to come in, and they're going to go against the southern kingdom, Judah, because the people of Judah, the leaders of Judah, are guilty of apostasy and idolatry, forgetfulness of God, worshiping other gods, social injustices. And so you've got nations fighting against nations in these texts here. And the prophets are okay with all of this, surprisingly. Isn't that a surprise? Okay, the prophets are okay with all of this. In fact, they predict it. So then you get both the prophets as characters and the prophetic literature are constructed in such a way as to support the empire. Now, that is probably surprising when we read it from a political perspective. The prophets as characters and the prophetic literature are constructed in such a way as to support the empire. Okay? The prophets are depicted as authority figures, and the prophetic texts are understood then to be authoritative. You know, Catholics consider the Bible to be authoritative. All right. And so whatever the prophets do gets sanctioned because they're the messengers of God. They're all men for the most part that we get here. Of all the writing prophets, they're all men. Now, isn't that surprising? Because you wonder, what would the women prophets do? What would they be doing? The ones who bear the children, what would they be doing? Would they be sanctioning the military? Would they be sanctioning the armies? Would they be happy with the babies being dashed against the stones that we're going to hear today? Yeah, so we have to raise these kinds of questions. The prophetic literature in the Bible is the product of an elite society intended mostly for an elite readership. That's the intention. Elite society wrote it, intended for an elite group of readership. So these are the well-educated people These are the people of power. That's what the texts were written for. They weren't written for the little people. They were addressing the people of power. And the prophets sometimes address the people of power that we see. The prophets sometimes address the social injustices, but in what way do they address the social injustice? So these so-called divine messages that we have invites readers and hearers into the lofty world of divinity and monarchical power, because that's the world in which we're living, monarchical power. And that's the world in which we are living, oligarchic power. And we are living in a world where, okay, you've got Putin coming eventually to the White House. You've got King Abdullah coming next week to the White House. You've had Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House this week. Just look at what we are going through in our world and look at, I'm trying to get this meeting transcribed here out. Okay, trying to get there I am, okay. And so when we get the oligarchs that we have here, you know, this is the same thing that we have. It's the elite group of people. This is who the texts were written for. And so the ethos of a monarchical society frames the message of the prophets, the ethos, heard especially through the use of prophetic messenger formula, thus says the Lord, which positions readers and listeners as the main recipients of the divine message. And so if it's a secondary edition and it was added on to the text, and so if you hear thus says the Lord, or God is speaking this way, you would sit up and you would listen. And that's how it was. It was to command the attention of the people. Now, what's interesting of this is the absence of God. The absence of God, but the presence of the prophet. Okay, the presence of the prophet, because God speaks through the prophet. All right, you don't get the presence of the divine when you get the divine speaking through the prophet. Asks the readers to accept passively the message and the messenger in the case of the nations, an imperial message of power from an imperial God who uses human spokespersons. Now, isn't that powerful? Okay, an imperial God using imperial message of power. And then we call this prophetic texts. Prophetic of what? Prophetic of the violence. It's showcasing, exposing, because the prophets expose. And so what are the prophets doing? The prophets are exposing the violence within their world. And they're exposing their own internalization of this violence, that they cannot see that there's something wrong when nation stands against nation, killing other people. Because you don't have the prophets coming out and speaking against the violence. There's only one time that you get this in Hosea. And I'll read that, and it's in Hosea 13 or 14, I think, and it's I am not mortal, and I will not come in vengeance. And so you get some beautiful prophetic texts here, but at the same time, the overwhelming majority of the prophetic texts showcase a real sense of violence, particularly when we get to the image of the divine one that's going to send famine and blight to destroy the land, because that's what was done. I mean, we would call that, you know, withholding aid today. So the framers of the prophetic texts and the prophets stand behind these acceptable prophetic figures, and in doing so, the framers of these texts hide themselves and the interests that they serve. By this means, they achieve credibility. They hide their interests and they hide themselves behind the texts whom they serve, because we have to ask the question, to whom do these texts serve? To whom these texts serve? So, imperialism. In many of the prophetic texts that address the nations, the passages contribute to the vision of a nation moving into the future with the rest of the world being subdued. Listen to that. In many of the prophetic texts that address the nations, the passages contribute to the vision of a nation moving into the future with the rest of the world subdued, its security guaranteed, and its place as a viable power assured. The way of imperialism is to gain more and more territory. Just hear that against what we're hearing now. Okay? The way of imperialism is to gain more and more territory. But that is what the Assyrian Empire did. The Assyrian Empire came in and conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. The Babylonians came in and conquered the southern kingdom of Judah. And Israel was a kingdom no more. And then after the Babylonians come the Persians. The Persians then conquered the Babylonians. And after the Persians, then come the Greeks. And after the Greeks came the Romans. So the cycle of imperial power and the drive to be an empire has been with us from ancient history, through biblical times, through contemporary times. We have the facade that what does it mean to be great? Does it mean military power? Does it mean the suppression of other nations? Does it mean oligarchic power? Does it mean financial security? And who wins and who loses? Who's the elite and who's not the elite? All right, these are the questions. The political world, global situation right now is going through tremendous shifts, tremendous shifts. And so we have to have our eyes open. And the shift is political, and it's social, and it's economic. And it's happening all over as nations jockey for position. As nations jockey for position. Okay? To imperialism, the prophets are characters in the prophetic texts. Aid in carrying out the imperialism because they have a blind eye to the zeal which allows them to accept the suffering of others caused by militarism in the name of justice. Militarism in the name of justice. We have to listen to this. Militarism in the name of justice. We have to look at this in terms of what just happened with Israel and Gaza. And the rhetoric, we have a right to defend ourselves. We have to listen to this because we have to go back in history and we have to look at the history of what has happened. Imperialism aims to subjugate the rest of the world's peoples and nations. To subjugate the rest of the world's peoples and nations. Isn't it amazing? Isn't it amazing that we now want to have the Riviera of the Middle East? Okay, and I don't care where you stand with this. I'm just talking about rhetoric because you have to sort it out. Okay, you have to sort it out. But who's going to own the Riviera? Who wants to buy that? Who wants to buy Greenland? Who wants Canada to come into the US? We got to look at this. We got to look at sovereign states and sovereign nations and the issues of imperialism, Russia and Ukraine. I mean, we got to look at that. We have to look at Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan, all of this. It's all about imperialism. It's all about power. It's all about empire building. And the oligarchs now are going to be the ones who are going to build the empires. Because the oligarchs are going to be the ones that are going to be behind the political leaders. The political leaders aren't doing this. The oligarchs are doing this. Okay? Money talks. We know that. Money is power. And we got the wealthiest man on the planet right now making some moves. Okay? All right. Now, so the contemporary world scene. The Middle East, Gaza, Israel, Israel's prime minister, US's president. the Ukraine-Russian conflict, the oligarchic restructuring of the United States government. Now we're going to look at some texts, and you tell me if you don't hear the world in front of the text with this. Here we go. And I'm going to share my screen. Let me get share. Okay. Okay, can you see my text?
Yes.
All right, here we go. The imperial God of the nations. Just let's listen. Isaiah 12, 9-20. See, the day of the Lord comes. And the day of the Lord used to be a day of salvation. Now it's going to be a day of vengeance, salvation for some, destruction for others. So what do we understand about this day of salvation? For whom? Cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the earth a desolation and to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for all their iniquity. Now you think about this and listen to this as I read this. This is the divine speaking to the prophet, supposedly, but at the same time, this is also, if you are a person of faith or a believer, if you're Jewish or if you're Christian, you see yourself as godly in the image of God. So the God language is so important. The images of God are so important because this is going to sanction the power of rulers. I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the pride of the arrogant and lay low the insolence of tyrants. I will make mortals more rare than fine gold, and humans than the gold of warfare. Therefore, I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place. The wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of his fierce anger, like a hunted gazelle, like sheep with no one to gather them. All will turn to their own people, and all will flee to their own lands. Whoever is found will be thrust through, and whoever is caught will fall by the sword. Their infants will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be plundered, and their wives ravished. See, I am stirring up the Medes against them, who will have no regard for silver and do not delight in the gold. Their bows will slaughter the young men, and they will have no mercy on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes will not pity children. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms and the splendor of the pride of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. Arabs will not pitch their tent there, and shepherds will not make their flocks lie down there. And this is the God of the nations. Okay, going against the cruel people. Can we hear this against the backdrop of what's going on today? Isaiah 19, 1-4, an oracle concerning Egypt. See, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. The idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. I will stir up Egyptians against Egyptians, and they will fight one against the other, neighbor against neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. The spirit of the Egyptians within them will be emptied out, and I will confound their plans. They will consult the idols and the spirits of the dead and the ghosts and the familiar spirits. I will deliver the Egyptians into the hand of a hard master, a fierce king who will rule them, says the sovereign, the Lord of hosts. And we remember the story of what Egypt did to Israel at the time of the Exodus. It's a story. But now the Egyptians are going to get their comeuppance by Israel's God. And it's what we call lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. What goes around comes around. You did this to my people, so now I'm going to do this to you. But notice, this is the word being delivered by the prophets. And the prophets are exposing the violence, but the prophets also, if you take this literally, are condoning and proliferating the violence. And since when do we have a God? Since when do we have a sacred presence, a holy one, who is going to be so murderous toward people? And if you have the commander-in-chief doing this, then what is to say the commander-in-chief of the nations do not do as the deity does? That's when you read with the grain. This is to say, yes, the Egyptians are going to suffer. Israel is going to be okay. That's when you read with the Jewish Christian tradition. But we have to raise the question, the bigger question, step out of the tradition, step out of these texts and look at these texts and say, what are we talking about here? What are we talking about here? And this one, Amos 1, 6-8. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they carried into exile entire communities to hand them over to Edom. So I will send a fire on the wall of Gaza, fire that shall devour its strongholds. I will cut off the inhabitants of Ashdod, and the one who holds the scepter from Ashkelon. I will turn my hand against Ekron, and the remnant of the Philistines shall perish, says the Lord. Let's read that against the contemporary background. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions in Gaza, for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they carried into exile entire communities to hand them over. Let's hear this in terms of Israel's perspective on Gaza. Fire, cut off the inhabitants. I will turn my hand against them, and the remnant of the Palestinians shall perish, says the Lord. Yeah. How do we hear those texts? Who are the empires? Who are the ones suffering? Who is God? Who is the Holy One of all people? Not just the Holy One of Israel, but the Holy One of all creation. And what really are these prophetic texts doing? These prophetic texts are really revealing to us and showing us and exposing us, because that's what the prophets do. Exposing. the human condition. And is this the God, the sacred one, the one to be loved? Or is this the God of the military? Or is this the God who weeps and who is lamenting? And if we are going to be prophetic teachers and prophetic preachers, what do we have to say about these texts? And these are our texts as well. They're not just the Jewish texts, because they're also the Christian texts. So what do you think? What's your response? You sit in silence. Social justice? Oh, Marian says, get rid of your Bibles. No, the Bible is not the problem. The Bible is a wonderful book because it's exposing the human story, the human life situation. We've got to learn from this. I've been reading these texts. Okay. I've been reading these texts with the grain, and my mind has been conditioned to accept that people can be obliterated in order to achieve the goals of empire. Yep. Yeah. How do you respond to people who sincerely believe Trump is a new King David, though imperfect in many ways, but sanctioned, forgiven by God, just like the biblical King David? That's the issue. Okay, because that's what we have to confront. Radical fundamentalist literalism. We read this text in a fundamentalist literalist way. And I mean, I'm not going to get political specifically, but we have a vice president who just said that I am a practicing Catholic, a devout Catholic, who was called out on his hierarchy of love, who espouses to all of this. What are we talking about? This is the problem that we have. Rampant fundamentalism, Catholic Christian right. These texts should be a misinterpretation of what the prophet said. Yes. Or the prophets are telling us something when you read the prophets against the grain. When the prophet says, thus says the Lord, the prophets are exposing what message they're being told to deliver, and they're exposing the harshness of everything. The problem we have is the prophets, don't take issue with any of this. They're just delivering this message. But they are the puppets of an imperial God, but at the same time, they are created by the elite who were in support of the empire. So the whole thing is prophetic. It exposes. Prophets expose the injustices. The whole thing is an injustice, but we can't take the role, we can't take seriously the message of the prophet. We can't take seriously the message that we see in this and say, you know, thanks be to God. No, we got to say, oh my God. The militaristic God is a vengeful God. That's Israel today. Yes, I'm hearing the Jesu text. You have said an eye for an eye, but I say, love thy neighbor, do good, turn the cheek. We are being invited to keep growing. Yes, but turn the cheek was not just this whole thing of forgive and forget. Turn the cheek was intended to be an insult. Not just turn the cheek. I give you this cheek and now you can hit this cheek. To turn the cheek was to be an insult. It was the insult of resistance. And love your neighbor, do good. Yeah, you can say love your neighbor. Israel can say love your neighbor, do good. Israel loved its people, and it's defending itself, and it's going after the Gazans, and under the guise of going after Hamas and all of this. But we also have to remember, go back in history and think. George W. Bush was told about Hamas coming into power, and he said, let it happen. He was warned about this. We got to understand our own history. And we got to understand our own leaders as well, too. I mean, you know, as I say, I don't care where you stand. Just understand why you stand, where you stand. So the prophets, when we read these against the grain, are exposing the human condition and the appeal to the divine to justify what they intend. Because that's why Sandra Schneider says the question for the 21st century is the God question. Is this God? Or is this a character given supreme authority to justify what is going on and to sanction what is going on? These are the questions. This is why the starting point has to be the encounter with the divine, and not not looking at these texts and saying this is God. It has to be, starting point has to be the encounter with the divine. And that's in the realm of spirituality. And when we have this encounter of the divine and we understand the divine on multiple levels from experience with all of this, then we're able to see these texts in a whole different light. And we're able also to have a sense of freedom as well, too, because where is our faith? Our faith is anchored in the experience and not anchored in a text or in a theology that appeals to the text. Because as Catholics, many of us are on here, we have scripture and tradition. But we talk about that. We never talk about being anchored in the encounter. Anchored in the encounter. Okay, now I want to get to the next piece with this metaphor. I'll see what I can do in 15 minutes here. So, metaphor, we're going to deal with Hosea 1-3. We're going to talk about marriage. Metaphors have the power to capture the human imagination, and they can inspire, teach lessons, shed light on realities not altogether seen, comprehended, or understood. Some metaphors, especially the ones we find in the Bible, are drawn from everyday life experience and often reflect reality. They have the potential of enabling one to discover and give new meaning to what might have been commonplace. Some metaphors can become entrenched, obsolete over time, and other metaphors can be wondrously new and fresh. So, for example, we get in the end of Hosea, I will be like dew to Israel. It's the fertility metaphors that we get for the divine. The divine, we have some beautiful, beautiful images and metaphors in the divine, in the prophetic texts. And the same thing when you get the Isaiah texts, I have called you will be a light to the nations. We're going to talk about the servant songs next week. Because of their appeal to the imagination and senses, metaphors have the capacity to move people at deep levels of their being. Now, I got a whole bunch of notes here, but I will skip some because I want to get to the discussion of the text. Aristotle's definition of metaphor has influenced metaphor theories for centuries, and Aristotle's thought developed what we call the substitution theory of metaphor, and it goes all the way back to the Roman rhetoricians Quintilian and the Roman orator and the philosopher Cicero, who used Aristotle's definition and developed their own understanding of metaphor. Then in the 20th century, we have people like Ivor Richards and Max Black and Paul Ricoeur, who developed this understanding of metaphor. And then a little bit later, we have George Lakoff and Mark Johnson and Mark Turner. They advanced the understanding of metaphor. And so metaphor has been an area of study for linguistic people and for also the philosophers. And then what we get here is one thing that's interesting is that metaphors involve thought and reason. And according to Lakoff, the locus of metaphor is not in language at all, but in the way we conceptualize one mental domain in terms of another. In other words, he says the locus of metaphor is thought. And this is important. It's thought. It's how we think about things. And our everyday behavior then reflects our metaphorical understanding of experience. And so Lakoff says that a relationship exists between metaphor and human behavior. And so if we have the metaphor of an imperial deity, a militaristic God, and we see ourselves made in God's image according to God's likeness, and for men who and women who want to see themselves as the heads of state and commanders in chief, then we're going to follow the same behavior. Now, we get another person, Job Jindo, who says that through an analysis of metaphor used in the Bible, we can gain an access to the conceptual world of biblical religion, how they envision their God in terms of metaphor, and it comes out of their sense of self. And we get the women who also take a look at metaphor, Susan Hyland and Hilary Marlowe. And the people that I have done some research with, which and hook into their understanding of metaphor, was Teresa Descamps and Eve Swetster, and theologian Sally McFague, whom you might be familiar with, and Brian Wren. And they ground the discussion of metaphor by looking at metaphor from a feminist liberation perspectives that call into question the human-divine relationship. And so what we see then is metaphors do have the capacity to affect readers and hearers' imaginations and give readers and hearers access not only to the mindsets and attitudes of those who shape the metaphors, but also to the world of biblical religion. But a point to be remembered is that readers and hearers also give meaning to the metaphors and allow metaphors to be heard in new ways and in new contexts. So therefore, metaphors are dynamic and not static. And what I find interesting is the work of Brian Wren, because he makes the case that the best language we have for God points to a revealed mystery. But he raises these questions for the appropriation of the God metaphors that we find in the book of the prophets. How far do our metaphors truly reveal God? How far do the metaphors truly reveal God? And which metaphors reveal God best? Because as I said, we've got a mix of metaphors here. You got the mother eagle who's going to hover over and protect the young. You've got God, like dew, to nurture and water and bring to life the people of the land. And so Wren gives consideration to what he calls systemic metaphors, ones that strongly structure human thinking and behavior, especially in relationship to what we see with the divine metaphors that we have. And he asserts that the language we use does not determine what we think, but it can certainly put us in blinders from which it is very difficult to escape. It puts us in blinders and we can't escape it. So, for example, one of the lead metaphors that is in all theological traditions within Christianity that we have is God as Father. And we keep using that same metaphor over and over again. Even if we switch it, like Elizabeth Johnson wanted to do God as Mother, it still is a gendered metaphor, when in fact we're talking about a sacred presence that defies all metaphors. Okay, so Wren sees human behavior, language use, and the way people think systemically intertwined. How people speak about God can shape, slant, and reflect their thinking and perception of the divine. And then he says there are some metaphors that are dead metaphors, that do not bring us life. And he raises the question about the metaphors: who benefits from the metaphor? Who suffers from it? What power relationships is it trying to perpetuate and legitimate? And see, that's what I just read when I read the whole text from Isaiah and Amos. What kind of a God do we have here? And so he invites us to do the deeper thinking and the assessment of metaphors that we find in the prophets. And to my way of thinking is that Hebrew Bible scholars have had little regard for the conceptual understanding of metaphor, and many interpreters who work in metaphor theory do not usually focus on how the metaphor affects the readers. See, because they stay, as I said, either the world behind the text, what is the culture that shaped the metaphors, or they say the world within the text, and they say, talk about how it functions within the text, but they don't talk about how it's shaping religious imagination and cultural imagination and political imagination. Clearly, the approach then needs to be one that reads these metaphors in the contemporary perspective, and they cannot be divorced from the globalized world. So the starting point for all interpretation can't be just the text. The starting point has to be the contemporary world in which the prophets are read today. And I keep saying that over and over again. We've got to hear these prophetic texts in the world, contemporary world, just as I read that one text about Gaza. Furthermore, the prophets and their interpretations, the book of the prophets, have to be assessed through the lens of the contemporary world that will expose the power dynamics and the unjust attitudes. See, our reading of the world, if we are critical thinkers about all of this, will help us with our interpretation of the text, because we have to deconstruct our world just as we have to deconstruct the text. What are the power relations here? Where does the power rest? Who is being served? Who is not being served? And if we are reading for justice, then the goal is to interrogate the text and to decolonize our reading of the text, the interpretations that have been given to us of the text, and to decolonize ourselves and our world. So radical new and transformative ideas, along with deconstructive lenses for both the text and the culture, must be shared and implemented for the sake of justice and the liberation of all creation. So that brings us, and we've got 5 minutes, to the whole theme of marriage. Domestic abuse from Psychology Today. When we look at this in terms of the world in front of the text here, Domestic violence can be physical or psychological, and this comes from an article in the Statistics in Psychology Today, and it can affect everyone in gender and race and sexual orientation. It includes insults, threats, emotional abuse, sexual coercion. Some of the perpetrators, now this is important, can use children and pets and other family members as emotional leverage to get their victim to do what they want. Victims of domestic violence experience diminished self-worth. Statistics from the UN Women, an estimated 736 million women, almost 1 in 3, have been subjected to physical and/or sexual intimate partner violence. An estimated 736 million women, almost 1 in 3, have been subjected to spousal abuse. Now, with that said, I'm just going to give a quick sharing of the screen here on this. And we can just take a look at this. We have time to read it. Okay, so you can see my screen? Yes? Can we see the screen? Just somebody tell me yes or no? Yes? Okay. Hosea 1-3. Now just listen to a little bit of this. When the Lord first spoke to Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take for yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." So he went and took Gomer, daughter of the Bilam, and she conceived and bore him a son. And this goes on to the families that she has. She conceived again and bore a daughter. When she had weaned, lo Ruhamah, she conceived and bore a son. Then the God said, "Name him Lo Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God." These were of all the names. So you get a little family here. And the story is, God says to Hosea, "Look, take back Gomer, the wife of whoredom here, who was an adulterous wife, who was not faithful to you. And just as you take back Gomer, so I will take Israel back." So the whole thing is one big metaphor. Okay? And so then you get, "Say to your brother Ami and to your sister Ruhamah, plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, and that she may put away her whoring from her face." Do you see how the children are involved? That's what we said. It's a form of abuse here. And her adultery from between her breasts. Just listen to this language. "Or I will strip her naked and expose her as in the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and turn her into a parched land, and kill her with thirst. Upon her children I will have no pity, because they are children of whoredom, for their mother has played the whore. She conceived, acts shamefully. Therefore I will hedge her up with thorns. I will build a wall against her. She shall pursue her lovers, but not overtake them. She shall seek them, but not find them. Then she shall say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was better with me than now. She did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, the oil, lavished her with silver, the gold used for Baal. Therefore, I will take back everything." Okay? Which was used to cover her nakedness. "I will uncover her shame in the sight of her lovers." So you get some pretty harsh language here on the part of the divine, saying what he is going to do, the image of God as husband, and the image of Hosea then as husband. And then you get, "Therefore I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. And then she'll call me my husband, no longer call me my Baal. And I will take her back and I will restore everything to her. You are my people. And he shall say, you are my God." So you get this whole scenario here, and it just goes on and on and on. You get this whole scenario, and I'm just going to stop here and pull this together for you, of an abusive relationship, an abusive family relationship here. How do we know what kind of husband Hosea was? But the male is always in the right. The female is always in the wrong. The female is the one who committed adultery. Eve was in the wrong. The woman in the circle is the one who is getting ready to be stoned by the men. And so we can see this. And this is a metaphor that the prophet uses, or in the prophetic texts, to talk about the waywardness of God's people who strayed from God. It's a jealous God. It's a jealous lover that you have. It's a jealous husband here. But the wrath will be cast upon the woman. And Hosea has to be in the right, because Hosea is going to represent God, and God has to be in the right. But when you look at the prophetic texts, the God who is lashing out at Israel, lashing out at the nations, lashing out and causing all kinds of harm and violence to those who are guilty of injustice. Is this the kind of deity you want to pray to? Is this the kind of deity you want to believe in? Because if you are guilty of an injustice, then this God is coming after you. Amazing, isn't it? But we see the violence. We see the violence. We see the domestic abuse used and cast in marital imagery. And this goes on today. Women are the victims more often than not of domestic violence and abusive relationships. And is this a marriage? Is this truly a marriage? And I will take you back. Well, should Gomer go back to this relationship? Some women do, and they end up being abused again. And yet the biblical text calls this, the interpreters of the text call this marriage. Should it be labeled as marriage? Whose marriage? Who's faithful? Who is served by this text? The woman or the man? And how do we know that Hosea hasn't been out and about doing many, many things? And yet, she has to bear all of this. She's the one that's called the whore. She's the one who's said to have children with whoredom. How do we hear this today? Against. And who should we be listening to? Should we be celebrating this text, reading with the grain and saying, oh yes, this is good. It's a metaphor. God takes Israel back. God will forgive just as God forgave Gomer. God will forgive Israel. Well, should we then take not the side of Gomer and have compassion on the woman and the women who are abused? And maybe some women are unfaithful because they're driven. They're driven by such abuse of husbands. And perhaps they find someone who loves them. And in biblical times, women could not divorce the men could divorce the women. And when women do divorce the men because of abuse, oftentimes the women are the ones who are economically unstable. Okay, Fran, you have your hand up.
Carol, it's about 20-25 after, so maybe we'll just
yes.
one question, if Fran.
That violence against women is increasing, and it's every few days where I am, you hear of one more woman that has been killed. So that violence is increasing, plus the violence in the world is increasing, and the narratives that inform our society and culture are growing stronger. and are about increasing violence. So it's like there's no nothing that can pull us back from it. So reading against the grain, there's a helplessness or a powerlessness in the whole thing because everything is ramped up at the moment.
Yeah. And what we have to do is we have to really, 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 really listen to those who are abused in relationships, and males are abused as well.
Okay.
Not just females. I'll take one more question
Well,
because we've heard a number from Fran. Somebody we haven't heard from, maybe.
maybe we could save our questions for next week then, Carol.
Yes.
I don't see any hands up. So if we could do that. And again, we thank you so much for your teaching us, your stretching, your challenging us, and you're inspiring us. We certainly look forward to next week, and we'll come with our questions. And we always end with a prayer, but perhaps our simple prayer is to take all the questions that you raised, and can we pray over them, that they may transform us and transform our world. So to all of you, good night, and we look forward to next week.
And I hope
Thank you,
this was
everyone.
okay for you. I hope it's okay.
Oh, it's been wonderful. Wonderful.
All right. And come next week too, before we go, with maybe a world issue that you see that needs a prophetic response. Because next week is our last week. If I got my dates right here.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's correct.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to look at the servant songs next week, and we'll look at a couple of contemporary issues. I'll deal with AI too.
Okay. All good topics.
Have a great week.
Good.
Thank you.